All right, another slide with pictures of fruit, and this is going to be a little bit of a stroll down memory lane for Bob and me. I'm going to give the history, and he's going to take you into the current work. But a lot of our inspiration for the Megaregions work really came out of the field of European spatial planning, which is essentially about polycentricity. It's about transnational planning. It's about development strategy. And I won't go into the bunch of grapes versus the banana, other than to say that if you want the definitive sort of analysis of this metaphor, our colleague Andreas Faludi actually had published a very thorough discussion of it in the Journal of Spatial Planning relatively recently, and it's quite an interesting story. But this has been set up as a dichotomy, the blue banana thought of as a kind of core periphery story, talking about the sort of predominance of the Londons and the Parises and the Milans. And the bunch of grapes is the more polycentric, let's share the wealth kind of concept, and they were opposed to each other, but Faludi makes a pretty convincing argument that the blue banana wasn't really that bad in the first place. But we were drawn to this notion that came out of Europe, that polycentric megaregions could actually be vehicles for territorial cohesion. In other words, we could deal with disparities, we could deal with left out places, and to the benefit of all. And so it's essentially a belief that through, as we've been hearing, the sort of the redistribution of costs of benefits, but also through agglomeration, creating higher productivity and more to share, it would be possible to actually increase welfare generally. And we were also fascinated in Europe by the commitment to high-speed rail as a particular method of connecting places and creating some of the sort of more efficient flows that would support the development of these polycentric regions. So Europe very much in the background. Bob and I and Jonathan Barnett in 2004, this must have been 2005, did a studio at the University of Pennsylvania, looked at a fairly simple projection of population out to mid-century, and this was kind of the frame for the studio, 2050, it turned into America 2050. And what we noticed was a very significant movement of population away from some regions toward others, with implications for even greater disparity, even greater economic inequality. And here's another view that actually takes into account population density. One of the things to note about the United States is we have a lot of big empty spaces with very few people, and we have some pretty dense cities. And interestingly enough, the densities, if you look at, say, the Northeast, very comparable to European densities. So it's not as if the whole country is sparsely populated, but large parts are. We'll come back to this idea. But one of the things that we noted at the time is that there was an expectation that a lot of rural areas in the country, and this was just out to 2030, would experience substantial increases in population. So this is a sprawl map, basically suggesting there's going to be considerable decentralization and sprawl, and undoubtedly the case. So for some reason, this struck people as, I don't know, Teletubbies or something of the time was sort of the model. But when Bob describes kind of squinting at the map and things emerging, this is something that came out of Sir Peter Hall's foundation in East London with a bunch of students. And it was sort of the earliest version of what we thought the megaregions looked like. And I can tell you it's largely intuitive. It's partly based on some things we knew about these places in terms of how they relate to each other. It's morphological in the sense that the shapes are kind of driving it, but there's really no data behind this, right? I mean, it's fair to say, Bob, no data whatsoever.
We made it up.
We made it up. Okay, so this whole thing is made up, right? That's essentially the confession. Well, what do we think are good about megaregions? Well, for one thing, there are issues that have to be dealt with at a scale that's larger than metropolitan areas. These include large infrastructure systems. We've already mentioned our interest in things like high-speed rail, large natural systems, and you'll see that we've developed quite an interest in large landscapes and this sort of landscape scale conservation, and thinking about megaregions as a device to be used in national planning. The name of the studio, I think when we started out, was A Plan for America, something like that. And I think I modestly changed that to Planning for America, thinking that maybe in one semester we wouldn't come up with the national plan. But in any case, over time and over some years, we ended up focusing on different parts of the country. We looked at the Northeast in particular, and you've seen some images of this. And it does go back, of course, to Gottman's Megalopolis and holds up pretty well as a real sort of zone of continuous or near continuous urbanization. And one of our student projects was to kind of think about this not just as an urban system, but an urban natural system with obviously a very significant set of resource systems that support urbanization and life as we know it. And actually a huge part of the area in the Northeast is pretty much dominated by nature and not by cities. But our interest is kind of the relationship between cities and nature. There's a book at the back of the room that is about that. And one of the things we were concerned about was that very likely pattern of growth in the small picture, the trend, which would have been for a fantastic amount of land consumption and sprawl, or a more smart growth approach, which would have accommodated the same amount of population, but in a much smaller footprint. And I think we made the simple statement that we could accommodate all of the growth that was expected to take place over the next 30 years in the existing footprint of urban Northeast. And part of this led to a kind of vision which would have dense hubs, stack them and pack them, I've heard is an expression that might be used. A lady in Colorado recently got very offended by this, quite to my surprise, and that these dense hubs would be connected with, we can now say, much better transportation systems. One of the things we did along the way was examine a lot of people don't like to be called underperforming. Makes it sound like it's their fault. Left behind. This is an old slide, so you have to say this is the history, right? We used to offend a lot of people all the time. I should say Bob used to offend a lot of people all the time. But in any case, the students worked up some indicators that would suggest that there are actually a range of counties that are not doing as well in terms of income and other characteristics, and they look something like that. And so one of the things we were interested in was what does this pattern really mean, and what does it suggest? And I don't know if you can see that very well, but if you superimpose the megaregion boundaries that we came up with the exception of the upper Midwest, these are outside of megaregions. So it's the story of essentially the left out rural parts of the United States that we're looking at. So all that student work led to a concept called America 2050, which was a campaign really to take this around the country. As Bob mentioned earlier, we did have meetings all over the place, and some people liked what they heard, and some people ran us out of town, but overall we did engage, and I'd say some of these things have caught on, and you'll see. We also did some further more rigorous looks at this. With the Regional Plan Association, we put out this high-speed rail policy focus report. And in another branch of our work, we developed a scheme for large landscape conservation, which is a complement to this, and that actually contributed to the national policy called America's Great Outdoors. And there are actually landscape conservation cooperatives which are used to attempt to work at this eco-regional landscape scale. Now, in terms of some of the sort of implications for today, and as a transition to thinking about the future, I happened to be meeting with folks in the National Policy Committee of the Royal Town Planning Institute right after the Brexit vote. And one of the things that came out of the conversation was a sense that nobody had run any scenarios as to what would happen if the thing passed. And it surprised me, but it's just everybody assumed it couldn't possibly pass, so there was no reason to seriously consider the consequences. But what you see in this picture is a voting map is a spatial pattern, right? I mean, it's a pretty clear spatial pattern, and there's a certain correlation. By the way, there was a reaction to the vote, you probably recall, which is the financial markets did not like this vote one bit. So the FTSE in England, the DAX in Germany, you see in one day a crash. So they knew something. But in any case, if you wanted to try to understand the vote, you might look at some of the economic disparities across the regions of the UK, and you might find a certain correlation between left out places, left out people, and votes for Brexit, which led us to the UK 2070 Commission, an inquiry into regional inequalities towards a framework for action. Alistair and I are both commissioners on this commission, looking out beyond Brexit and looking out even beyond 2050 to a point that is far enough out that we think we can have a civil conversation about it in a very divided country or set of countries. Which brings us to another unanticipated result for which the scenarios had not been run. And here is a map that you might want to associate with some of the sort of socioeconomic characteristics of the country, but it's a little hard because it's so red. And again, this is the problem of population density and the very sparsely populated parts of the country. Lots of counties are red, but they don't represent the majority of the population. And if you try to explain something like our left out places map, as we call it now, with this, it doesn't help because it's just so red. But if you look at a somewhat more refined version of this, which is simply the shift in vote from 2012 to 2016 from red to blue, from blue to red, it actually looks quite a bit more. You see, this is the kind of rigorous analysis we do. You see, it looks just like it. So that's my leave-off point for Bob to take over.
Well, thank you, Armando, for that overview. It's been we've been at this for 15 years, I guess, and since then, this is a quick look at the work that we're doing now in the northern half of the northeast megaregion between New York City and Boston, and then going up into the rest of New England. Since we did that first studio, and it was an interesting process. We started the Plan for America studio, and my dean at the time, Gary Hack, who many of you know from his days at MIT before he went to Penn, he said, hey Bob, studios are supposed to focus on neighborhoods in Philadelphia, and you're going to look at the entire country and out 50 years. Are you kidding? And so yeah, that's what we're doing. And so it was kind of a leap into the abyss, and we learned a lot about future development patterns in the United States, and we did have some success with America 2050. I never anticipated that it was going to create this ongoing program, but it did. And again, in a partnership that Armando and I put together, we ran America 2050 for about 10 years, and looking at the future of the country, future development patterns, the future of the left behind places, the future of the nation's infrastructure systems. We had an relatively early success during the Bush administration, interestingly, in 2008 with the PREA legislation, where we broke a deadlock in the Congress, and with help from the White House, we got a provision that included authorization for the creation of a network of high-speed rail lines across the United States, and authorization for the Congress to appropriate funds. And that later, the following year, $10 billion were included in the ARA Recovery Act for high-speed rail, and additional billion the year after that, and then the Republicans, of course, took over the Congress and tried to shut down everything that Obama tried to advance. And I've often said since then that if Obama had been against high-speed rail, the current Congress would be for it. But we are where we are. And I'm a planner, Armando's a planner, and so we're really thinking about, not just research for research's sake, but also how we can take these insights and begin to shape the future of the country and so forth. We've run about 15 different studios at Penn since then, and places as far ranging as Beijing and Singapore and Casablanca and Madrid and Marseille. We've had some really good food along the way and very entertaining travelogues and so forth. And we've learned a lot about the emergence of megaregions and how we can use this concept to shape the future of our country and of other countries. The latest project, I started this in 2016 with a studio that took a look at the left behind cities of New England, and there are about 20 of these places, these old industrial centers across the region, that even though New York and Boston are booming, and by the way, 25, 30 years ago, I started my career here in Boston, and Boston was not booming at the time in the early 1970s, and I seem to have had a career moving from formerly developed places.
25 or 30 years ago.
What's that? What's that?
That's more than 25 or 30
Well, it
years
actually
ago.
was about 40, 50 years ago, so time flies when you're having fun. But, the interesting thing is I started my career actually in New Britain, Connecticut, which is actually coming back now, and then moved to Boston in 1972 to work for the Boston Redevelopment Authority at a time when Boston was on a Fortune magazine list of, quote, America's Death Watch cities, along with Cleveland and Newark and Oakland and a bunch of other places, that Detroit. Hard to believe now that Boston was on that list, but it was. And I had the opportunity to work with some very talented people in business, civic, government communities, city and state government to, over a period of about 15 years to begin the process of turning Boston around. And of course, it is possible to turn the cities around. It takes time. Things take time, and it takes leadership, from city and state level, business and civic leadership, and so forth. And really, the insight from all of that work participated along with a lot of other people in New York and doing the same thing over 25 years at Regional Plan Association. And again, I started in New York in the late 80s at a time when New York was given up for dead by a lot of people. I had a bookcase in the office that I called my Death of New York bookcase, with titles like The Death of New York, The End of New York, The Decline of New York. People forget that the Robert Moses, power broker biography, the subtitle was Robert Moses and the Decline of New York. Well, a very funny thing happened on the way to the funeral. The corpse kind of had signs of life and so forth. And all of this inspired me to think that places like Springfield, Massachusetts, and let's think of the others, New Haven and others that have been given up for dead, really, we do have the potential to bring them back. And that inspired this idea that we could take the megaregion concept and use it to build on the success of New York and Boston, to expand the prosperity of the region into all of these left behind older industrial cities. So the idea here is that we have these bookends, New York and Boston, which collectively have an economy of about $3 trillion. This month it is just ever so slightly smaller than the economy of the United Kingdom, but next month it will be larger than the economy of the United Kingdom if things continue with the Brexit on its current course. Time to do your mail order stuff to British retailers and stuff, right? So I'll be getting those British seagull parts from the UK coming next in a few weeks. But the idea is that if we can connect the dots between New York and Boston and extend the prosperity of these cities, we can both fix the problems, I call them the existential threats to the future success of New York and Boston, and we can revitalize these older industrial cities in between, mid-sized places. The cities themselves, populations of 140, 50 to a quarter of a million, but in city regions that are in many cases are 500,000 or 1 million people in size. These are the existential threats. Congestion. The image on the lower left is of I-95 in Connecticut. Our former governor, Dan Malloy, described Connecticut's transportation lifelines to New York. I-95 and the Merritt Parkway, he said the first one is a parking lot and the second one is a museum. And we're beyond gridlock now. We're beyond congestion. We've got congealed highways. This is congestion, 18, 20 hours a day. You cannot depend on these transportation links. The second one, housing affordability. And this is, it's kind of hard to read this, but these have got prices, housing prices, and the three-decker that I lived in when I was a graduate student at Harvard, and I paid $150 a month for, recently the third floor unit recently sold for $800,000, and this is a third floor walk-up that was built for a plumber or an electrician or something 100 years ago, and now only the wealthiest people can afford to live there. This is going to kill these places in the long run, because the millennials, who drive the innovation economy, are simply not going to continue to come to these places if they can't afford to live here, or if they can't afford to get around. They can't get around. And then the third thing is climate change. That New York and Boston, both of them, have had serious problems with storm surges. Last year, what were there, 4 nor'easters in a row that put large areas of the downtown waterfront and the seaport underwater, and it's only going to get worse with sea level rise and more severe storms and so forth. So we got all our eggs in 2 baskets, and we really could be putting our eggs into a much more diverse set of baskets across the region. Many of them inland. A lot of our infrastructure, and this is another issue, is that the existing Northeast corridor, a lot of it is in the coastal zone. It floods from time to time, and it will flood to time more frequently in the future. Let's see. Okay, so housing costs and congestion are creating this crisis for the big metros, New York and Boston, and then there are opportunities in the places in between, where we've got higher vacancy rates, lower rents, and so forth. So the idea here is to look at strategies to integrate the housing and labor markets and of New York and Boston and all of the cities in between, with the goal of mitigating these threats and essentially looking at all of these left behind mid-sized cities in between as opportunity zones, and to use the current phrase, but as places where we have opportunities. And we're looking at the idea of high-speed rail, and Foster's been a partner in all of these projects going back to 2010. When we started working on the Northeast Corridor high-speed rail proposal. But the idea is to use a high-performance rail network, high-speed rail as the spine, but then a network of connecting rail lines that essentially will connect all of these places to each other and to New York and Boston. Each of these cities has enormous assets, walkable downtowns, a lot of good historic fabric, good bones, access to skilled workers, relatively affordable housing, and we have the opportunities by creating this larger innovation network between New York and Boston to build redundancy, reduce the vulnerability to climate change and so forth. How is this possible to do this? And one of the things that we've been looking at is success stories around the country in mid-sized cities that have rebooted themselves, that have bootstrapped themselves back from the abyss, and there are dozens of them, and there's some lessons learned that we've turned into kind of I'll call it a cookbook, but the idea is that that no one-size-fits-all strategies, no silver bullets, that we're talking probably 25 or 30 different strategies that have been used in different combinations in different cities across the country. The fundamental thing that's driving the opportunity here is that the millennials are beginning to turn their backs on the big coastal cities because they can't afford to live here. They're tired of congestion, and they want to live in places where they can create their own environments, which you can't do anymore in Brooklyn or Brookline or any of these places around New York or Boston. And again, so it's the push out of the big cities, and then it's the draw of these smaller, mid-sized cities across the country and here in New England. The other idea here is that if we can integrate the economies of New York and Boston, the places in between, that we do create what would function as the 6th largest economy in the world, bigger than France, bigger than Italy, just behind the UK, and soon to be just ahead of the UK in terms of its size if the Brexit crash out happens. We've got opportunities to to take this current problem, which is higher vacancy rates, low rents. The rents are too low in downtown Hartford or Providence and so forth to support new construction at the moment. The rents and turn that into an opportunity, essentially by redirecting growth and attracting growth to the mid-sized cities in between. The key first step, we think, is to build this high-performance rail network between New York and Boston and all of the connecting routes. Foster, I think, we heard this in Manchester a couple of years ago. Somebody used the analogy of airports, and they said if you built the world's best airport, 8 runways and fabulous terminals and a great high-speed rail line into the center city, it would be an enormous asset and a nice place to go for coffee and so forth, unless there was another airport that you could fly to. If you built 2 of them, you'd have a really terrific airport, and you might be able to get to that other city, but it wouldn't be that much of an asset. But if you built a network of airports, and you could get from your fancy airport to dozens of other places around the country and around the world, you really have created an asset that will be transformational. And railroads are kind of like that too, that this is not just about building a single line between New York and Boston, it's building a network of rail lines that link all of these cities to each other and create a set of connections that are not possible now. Again, the idea is to use this network to underpin the integration of labor and housing markets, to integrate the economies of all of the mid-sized cities with New York and Boston and with Long Island, this faraway place across Long Island Sound, 19 miles away from Connecticut. And produce a set of secondary benefits of reduced carbon production, sprawl, land consumption, and so forth. And at the same time, rebuild the tax base of these mid-sized cities and of the 6 New England states. The goal is to create this high-speed rail network. I guess I just said all of that, so here it is. And I'll show you the phasing plan now. The current infrastructure is the Northeast Corridor, which runs along the coast from New York to Boston. A lot of this is in the coastal zone and subject to flooding and so forth. The NEC Future Plan, or Tier 1 EIS that came out a couple of years ago, FRA kind of screwed it up. I mean, they proposed, as they said, the easiest thing to do is just to upgrade the existing network through Fairfield County, the busiest commuter rail corridor in the country, and then extend it east, straighten it out a little bit to get some of the curves out and so forth, and then connect back into the existing Northeast Corridor, a route that was electrified about 25 years ago. And they ran into a little problem in Connecticut. And the first one was that they had to add at least 1 and probably 2 new tracks through Fairfield County. There's no right-of-way. It's the capital, the NIMBY capital of the galaxy, and so people went nuts. And then where I live in east of New Haven, they managed to hit every historic district, wetland, wildlife refuge between New Haven and Kingston, Rhode Island. Everybody, and they forgot to talk to any of the local officials. So people read about this in the papers, which is, those of you who've been involved in citing infrastructure projects or moving public works know that's not a good thing to do. So first selectmen and selectmen across southern New England went nuts, and you really have to work at getting 4 United States senators to threaten to tie themselves to the tracks, but that's what happened. And a rare example of collaboration between 2 New England states. So our modest proposal is to, we held a series of workshops over the last couple of years with help from Lincoln and a group of community foundations across southern New England, and just to try out some of these ideas and listen to locals about what they wanted to hear. And what we heard everywhere in New England, and this is, those of you who've worked here will recognize this phenomenon. We have 6 states here that have been seen as a region with a coherent culture and tradition and all of this stuff. The reality is that these states really don't like each other and haven't collaborated on anything ever. I'm reminded I got into trouble when we got the PREA legislation passed. I went to my board in New York. Now this is a little more than the Northeast Corridor, but the same idea, and said that this was the first time since the passage of the Bill of Rights in 1789 or 1790, whatever, that the northeastern states had worked together in a collaborative way. And one of my board members at Regional Plan, Ken Jackson, who's a great Columbia University historian, puts his hand up and says, "You're wrong." I said, really? He said, yeah, New York voted against the Bill of Rights. And it's kind of like that. So there isn't a long tradition, and this is one of the problems that we're running into. So we went to across the region, and everybody said, that's a great idea, but we don't really need this whole thing. But what we really go to people in Connecticut, this what we really need is this. We want to see the existing New Haven line upgraded so we get, go from 2-hour travel time to hour and 10-minute travel time, or something like that, and more frequent service. We go to Western Massachusetts, they say, well, this is great, but the only thing we need is this, from getting to Springfield to Worcester, and then we'll connect into the existing high-speed rail line. The folks in Rhode Island said, well, we really don't need the whole thing, but if you could upgrade the existing service in the Northeast Corridor so we can get more frequent service into South Station and maybe extend it down to Kingston. So that's really all that we need. And then initial conversations in Northern New England said, yeah, we don't really need the rest of that stuff, but if you connected, did commuter rail up to Manchester and Concord, New Hampshire from Boston, that'd be great. And the people in Southern Vermont said, well, maybe you could extend that commuter rail line that was just built up from Hartford to Springfield and connect it up into the valley and up to Brattleboro. That'd be fine, but don't give us the whole thing. We really don't need that. And of course, the problem is that nobody has a plug nickel to build their own local project. So the idea here is to create something that creates benefits for the entire region. See if we can get 12 senators from the 6 New England states, or 14 if we can get New York signed on. We've had initial conversations with Chuck Schumer about this. He's intrigued, says just do the Long Island piece, don't bother me with anything else, but so get Chuck signed on and Gillibrand signed on and do this, and possibly even plug Gateway into this thing, which isn't going anywhere with just New York and New Jersey, the Hudson River Tunnel. So the idea is to see if we can get the political economy of New England working for us. We have this problem that we have 6 states that don't like each other, don't have a history. That's the bad news. The good news, we have 12 United States senators. So if we can get them all on the same platform working together, we think we have an opportunity. We've had some initial discussions with members of the delegation. So this is the phase one is to do everybody's first high priority and say, let's get going and get into the business of collaborating and get the entire delegation working together to do that. Phase two is to build a high-speed rail spine, which would go, instead of going up the New Haven line and then pissing off everybody in Fairfield County again, because every high-speed train would blow half a dozen Metro-North trains out of the service because they'd be going too fast, that we'd run east on Long Island and mostly existing rights-of-way, a new tunnel under Long Island Sound, which people go like this, but the reality is that there are 20 or 25 places around the world that have built rail tunnels like this with tunnel boring machines. Upgrade the existing line to Hartford and then build a new line from Hartford to Providence, Rhode Island, and then upgrade the existing service to Boston. Modest problem here that, remember Armando's map of big green landscapes? One of them is this one, which is the Last Green Valley National Heritage Corridor, National Park, and we're working with them to see if we can find an alignment that works and some benefits for the bypassed mill villages and mill towns in that part of the world. So that's phase two. And then phase three is basically creating the rest of the network. So the folks in Western Mass also said extend the Danbury branch of Metro-North up to Pittsfield, again, build the commuter rail connection from Concord to Boston, upgrade the Downeaster service to Portland and Brunswick and eventually on to Bangor. Complete the regional rail networks around New York and Boston, build a new line down to the South Coast that's been proposed for decades and hasn't gone anywhere, and a bunch of other improvements that basically turn this into a network that connects all of these places to each other. And each one of these cities, which currently doesn't have the size or the labor market to create agglomeration economies by connecting them all to each other and then to New York and Boston, we think we can create those synergies for all of these places. Project finance, this is a $100 billion initiative. That's a lot of money. That's what the rest of the world. Alistair, what's the Northern Powerhouse proposing to spend on HS2 and Northern Powerhouse Rail? Do you have the round number?
Is it 9 billion? It starts, it keeps going up. 9 billion, something like that?
Well, HS2 is $77 million. And HS3, is probably in the neighborhood of 25 or 30, the Northern Powers, about $100 billion. So if the other place that has a $3 trillion economy can afford to spend $100 billion to transform the economy, and the economic future of of the whole country. Can we do the same thing for a region that has an economy the size of this one? We think we can. $100 billion, by the way, is predicated on the notion that this is a very dramatic and crazy notion that we would spend only twice as much per mile on these rail improvements as the Germans and the Brits are spending, and not 4 times as much, which is what we've been doing in this country. So it's a dramatic proposal with permitting reform and procurement reform and project management reform and labor practice reform and so forth. That we and a lot of this stuff is borrowed liberally from the Northern Powerhouse project. The idea of they've created a Transport for the North. It's a knockoff on Transport for London to plan and implement the transportation improvements in the north of England. We're proposing to do the same thing here, a partnership of the 6 states and the federal government to deliver this project in a more efficient way than we have in the past. Again, another knockoff on the Northern Powerhouse in England. We're, at least at the moment, calling a Northern Powerhouse Partnership, but a civic-led group that would coordinate all of the other economic development strategies: local transport, housing, urban amenities, training, job training, other activities. We're suggesting that the federal share could be 2/3 to 3/4. When we pressed, I'm trying to remember, John Godfrey was his name, the guy in the Prime Minister's office who was advancing the Northern Powerhouse project and so forth. When we asked him how the UK government is financing their $100 billion investment, the answer was debt. And they said, well, 80 or 90% of the UK Treasury debt is being purchased by sovereign wealth funds, and thank you to our Chinese friends. We really appreciate all the hard work that you guys are doing on our behalf, and the Malaysian government and the Sultan of Brunei and all those people. So 80 or 90% is being purchased by sovereign wealth funds. The lowest interest rates in 400 years since Drake and fought the Spanish Armada. Interest rates are lower than they were then. Why wouldn't we allow the rest of the world to rebuild our infrastructure? And they've done the calculations they've done the business case studies that Foster mentioned earlier to demonstrate that they have very realistic expectations that the increase in employment and tax revenues over time would more than cover debt service on this thing. So we're saying we should be doing the same thing here. States would come up with a quarter to a third of the rest of it through a range of alternatives, including value capture, but not limited to value capture. We've done some preliminary estimates. The students have done a good job. We'll be confirming these this year on an economic benefit analysis. We've had help from Jim Steer at Steer Associates in the UK, who did the Northern Powerhouse Rail and the HS2 business case studies. We think we can generate $1 trillion in new revenues through this economic transformation, 2.5 to 1 benefit cost ratio, and then a whole range of travel time savings and carbon reduction and land use changes and social equity and other benefits, and increase federal and state tax revenues that more than pay for the whole damn thing over time. The experience we've seen in the UK, this is King's Cross in London, that the economic transformation begins before you put a spade in the ground. As soon as you make the commitment to these things, that the private sector starts to make investment decisions around these projects. We would expect the same thing to happen in New England cities. And one of the challenges is to get there. This is Lincoln land, at 101. How do we get in there and before the land speculators get there and make it impossible for the local folks to benefit from these investments? And that's something that we're working on now. Our next steps and continuing our series of roundtable discussions. We have an emerging steering committee of business and civic leaders and some government leaders from across New England who've expressed interest. We've got a growing number of members of Congress who've expressed interest in the project. We're hoping to complete a business case study over the coming year, and again, this starts to be a very political kind of process. Could this be a component of a Green New Deal? I suspect that it could. Will this administration take this forward? I'm not clear that it would, but if there were $1 trillion infrastructure program, we would hope that our 12 or 14 or 16 member delegation would raise their hands and say we want to be a part of it, at least to get a down payment on the project. That's where we are. Thank you.